everyone. Good evening. Hi. Thank you for joining us tonight. Please remember to quiet your cell phones. My name is Tatiana, as you've already met me in the solarium. Just to make a correction, the presentation, the total time is 15 minutes, and we're going to have 5 minutes until the next presentation. And I'm going to introduce to you each speaker by telling you 2 truths and 1 lie about them. Afterwards, at the reception, please just chat with them and find out which one of them was false. Our first speaker today is Stephanie Juice. She's a PhD student. She has hiked all 48 of the 4,000 footers in New Hampshire. She helped to found a youth chess club in Bolivia. And also, she's a certified wildland firefighter in Venezuela. So please welcome Stephanie.
All right. So today I'm going to present on one of the projects for my dissertation, examining the effects of climate change and soil characteristics on water, nutrient, and carbon dynamics in northern hardwood forests. So I imagine most people in this room have seen a figure like this. We're looking at the trend of global surface temperatures over time. So on the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis is the difference between the temperature of any given year with the long-term mean. So we see that over the course of time, temperatures globally have just increased greatly. And if we zoom in regionally to the northeast, you can see very similar trends. And this figure is laid out exactly the same with the time on the x and temperature change on the y. And the solid line shows observed temperatures. So if we zoom in to the period since 1970, you can see that in the Northeast, we've had an annual temperature increase of almost 1/3 degree Celsius and a winter temperature increase of 0.7 degrees Celsius. So we're experiencing much more warming during the winter season than we are during the year as a whole. And if you project these this observed trend out to the end of the century, there are projections that say that by the year 2100, winter temperatures could have increased by as much as 5.4 degrees Celsius. So a really significant change in winter climate in our region. This, of course, has important implications for snow and snow dynamics. So the observed increase in the frost-free period for our region so far has been 10 days as of 2014. And you can see that this is true across the country. If you, again, project this out to the end of the century, models predict that these white areas will still have seasonal snow cover, but that compared to this larger red area of historic snow cover is very diminished. So why is snow important? It basically acts as an insulator to everything below ground. It protects roots as well as microbes, bacteria and fungi from mechanical damage caused by soil freezing, and it also helps preserve liquid water, which allows for biological activity below ground. So as we are losing our snow cover, we are potentially increasing soil freezing with important biological implications. So when we look at these effects of climate change together, you look at the increasing temperatures and the decreasing snow period, there are going to be important biological implications of this, especially looking at activity of microbes below ground as well as plants. One of these schools of differences is examining differences in timing of biological events. The study is called phenology. And when you look at the phenology of soil activity, it is very much coupled with soil temperature. Whereas if you look at the phenology of plant activity, it is a more complex suite of variables that affect it. And so these periods in spring and fall, when you have temperatures warm enough for biological activity in the soils, but not necessarily, but plants haven't responded as quickly to that change, we have the potential to have a situation in which the biological activity in soils is increasing nutrient availability in the soils, but the plants aren't active to take those up. And so this creates pools of nutrients that are vulnerable to leaching. This is a natural, this happens even without the effects of climate change, but these periods are being observed to be increased because of the changes associated with the warming climate. So in addition to all these effects of climate change, we see that we have an extremely heterogeneous landscape. This figure just shows you different soil orders throughout the United States. And if you zoom in on the Northeast region, we see that we have a large variability in soil chemical properties here, represented by pH. And we also have large variability in soil textures, as represented by the previous map. We may think that as we're examining the effects of climate change, that it's valuable to look at how those effects vary on different natural landscapes. In addition to looking at the effects of climate change on this heterogeneous natural landscape, it's valuable to consider that there are other environmental perturbations happening at the same time across the same landscape, and that some of those effects may interact and could potentially change the outcome that we see for our natural ecosystems. So this figure is representing it's representing acid deposition, which has been a long-term environmental perturbation in the Northeast U.S. that has resulted in acidification of soils through leaching of base cations from the system. And so the objective of my research is to pull these ideas together. So I'm really interested in what are the effects of soil characteristics, both physical and chemical soil characteristics, along with these environmental perturbations in the form of climate change, and how do those affect ecosystem carbon and nitrogen. So carbon is extremely important, both thinking in terms of climate models and atmospheric composition of carbon dioxide, but it's also extremely important for the productivity of plants themselves. So of all the carbon that has been, the carbon dioxide that people emit to the atmosphere, only about 50% is accumulating there. We see that through calculations, it appears that 30% is being taken up by terrestrial ecosystems. And so understanding both how the dynamics that allow plants to take up the carbon from the atmosphere, as well as the ecosystem dynamics that cause the carbon to be emitted back to the atmosphere, helps us to understand what future climate conditions may be like. So just to reiterate, carbon is important for forest productivity. It's taken up through photosynthesis by vegetation. It's stored both in the vegetation itself as well as in the soils, and it's lost gaseously through respiration, and it's lost from the system as dissolved organic carbon in water losses into streams and rivers and lakes. And then, of course, nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus are also extremely important to maintain plant productivity, and the losses of those nutrients to water is also detrimental to water quality. We see this in this region with the harmful algal blooms in the lake being caused by excess nutrients. And so these dynamics of understanding how Northeast forests are responding to climate change and how that is feeding back into carbon and nutrient cycling is really at the heart of this project. So within this context, I set out several different hypotheses. First, regarding those differences in climate that I described, how we're experiencing both warming and soil freezing. I hypothesize that both carbon and nitrogen losses will be greater under those climate conditions than under control conditions. And also getting back to soil texture, that because of the different water holding capacity of coarse textured soils, that we may experience more carbon and nutrient losses through water in those soils as compared to finer soils. And then thinking about these activity mismatches between microbes and plants, I predict that ecosystem warming will increase the length of that mismatch, and that increasing the lengths of those mismatches will then increase the loss of carbon and nutrients from these systems. Conversely, I'm predicting that soil freezing will actually decrease those mismatches just due to the lag time required for soils to actually thaw and become active after the snowpack is lost. So I'm testing these ideas in an experiment that we call the Northern Forest Mesocosm experiment. It was set up back behind the Spear Street Lab, and it consists of 2 different soil types that are represented by these different shapes. So one soil is a coarse textured soil with high calcium, and the other soil is a fine textured soil with low calcium. The calcium levels get at the question of acid deposition in this region, and then the textures, not to give a spoiler, but we actually think the texture is much more important in this case because of the water dynamics. And then, so in addition to the 2 different soils, we have 3 different climate treatments that were control, above ground warming of 2 degrees Celsius, and a snow exclusion, which by excluding the snow, you can induce soil freezing. So this is just what those treatments look like. Up here we have the above ground warming was achieved through infrared lamps. And the snow exclusion we achieved for the first 6 weeks of winter by putting up tarps just to prevent the snow from falling. We allowed a couple inches of snow to fall to maintain the reflectivity of the surface. The mesocosms themselves are closed systems. They consist of a pipe down the middle so that we can extract water by pumping it up and out. They have a gravel leachate area at the bottom, and then just whichever soil type is in them. This is what they look like above ground. This is a collaborative project, so my section is focused on soils, but there are other people who were studying the plants that we planted in them. So the plants were chosen to be to meet one of 2 characteristics, or I guess both characteristics. First, we were interested in their rooting depth because based on how deep their roots are could have effects on how much the soil frost impacts their ability to take up nutrients through that physical breakage of roots. And then we were also interested in where South Burlington falls in their range to think about range shifts with these different climate treatments if they would affect the ability of plants to persist in the area. So throughout the experiment, we measured soil temperature as well as soil moisture, and in the snow-covered period, we measured snow depth and soil frost depth to measure the effects of our treatments. I am in the process still of analyzing much of these data, so I am identifying these activity mismatches by looking at the soil temperature when it's warm enough to foster microbial activity, and then matching it up with when the plants were not active. So in the spring, we measured this by rating leaf out of each plant, and in the fall, we measured it through digital images measuring biomass. This is how we extracted all the the water from that leachate drainage area with a totalizer that counted how many gallons came out. And then we just grabbed samples of that leachate and were able to analyze it for inorganic nitrogen as well as phosphorus and other more minor elements. In terms of looking at metrics of soil activity, I measured nitrogen mineralization and nitrification through an incubation in each mesocosm, both in the growing season and throughout the winter. And then I additionally measured soil respiration, which you can see is achieved here, measuring the flux rate of carbon dioxide coming out of each mesocosm periodically throughout the snow-free period. So I'm analyzing the data now, as I said. The goal is to characterize the treatments and both throughout the year and specifically during those asynchronous periods through an analysis of variance as well as repeated measures analysis of variance where time was a factor due to repeated measurements. So these are just a few of my initial results so far. We see that both of the climate treatments actually reduced the leachate volume. And looking at the chemistry of that leachate, there were greater dissolved organic carbon losses in the heated treatment, and also greater dissolved organic carbon losses from the coarser soils. So those last two results were in line with the hypotheses that I laid out at the beginning. So with that, I don't know if I have time for questions. I will just thank you for your attention.